So before we get into his presentation, we would like to ask everyone listening in to please mute your audio if you haven't already. We will be taking questions via the WebEx chat function. So if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please feel free to type those in, and I will be passing them along to Kenneth at the end of the presentation during the Q&A section. All right, so if you could turn your attention to the slides in the meeting space, I think Kenneth was ready to start.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you to all the listeners in this webinar. I want to start off with a caveat, and that is that while I have worked in not-for-profits for actually 35 years, they've been educational and research-oriented not-for-profits as opposed to museums or daycare or other benevolent organizations, which have cultures of their own. But I think there are still lessons that really cross jurisdictions, if you will, and even from the not-for-profit world to the for-profit world in this regard. Just want to briefly describe what we're going to be talking about today. A little bit about me. We've already touched on that. Should a not-for-profit, an NFP, run like a for-profit business? Who sets the tone in the organization? Revenue diversification, mission focus, being opportunistic, utilizing a board of trustees, what price genius, and general thoughts on leadership. So I've already mentioned that I've worked in independent biomedical research institutions and one university, Tufts University Veterinary School, for 35 plus years. And given that there are different corporate cultures even within the research community, different levels of trustee involvement and staff interactions, one general lesson I certainly learned is that there's no one right way to do things. Furthermore, there's often difficult choices, particularly in financial prioritization, between a bad choice and a worse choice. But as the executive, you need to make those choices. So, should a not-for-profit operate like a business? Because not-for-profits have charitable purposes, they're sometimes run without discipline deficiency. And I would argue that running an NFP as efficiently as possible means there are more resources with which to pursue the mission of the organization. So it's not that you're being unfair, it's that you're really being fair to your mission by running as efficiently as possible. And like a for-profit company, a not-for-profit needs to aggressively seek diverse sources of revenue, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Getting back to the efficiency, I worked with one organization that had to have a significant series of layoffs. There just was not enough grant income to justify the number of people who were on board. And unfortunately, those are never easy kinds of situations to deal with. But there were some people who said, we're a charitable organization, we really ought to keep people on even though we can't really afford it. And again, I would argue that that kind of thinking takes away from the mission of the organization. So hard decisions sometimes have to be made, but the mission is what really counts. Now, sometimes, particularly trustees, look upon operating surpluses as generally a good thing for not-for-profits. And I, of course, would argue that that's true. On the other hand, surpluses, if they're accrued at the expense of really adequately fulfilling the core mission, if the staff isn't right, if it isn't paid enough, if the facilities aren't good, then any kind of operating surpluses that you get, to me, are not really reasonable. So there's a balance between operating at a surplus and operating at a staff or facilities or equipment deficit. Now, what are some differences between not-for-profits and for-profits? Well, in the not-for-profit world, the key really is the mission as opposed to profitability of the organization. Authority in a not-for-profit, particularly in an academic one with which I'm most familiar, is generally much more diffuse than in a for-profit, and that makes management pretty challenging at times. Community goodwill is more important for a not-for-profit because they depend upon support, charitable support from the community, individuals, corporations, foundations, than a for-profit. But ironically, many for-profits are better citizens than some not-for-profits. I worked in an organization once where we had a zoning challenge, and I had to go to the zoning board to try to get an amendment to the zoning bylaws. And my boss, the president, said, well, we're the XYZ Institute. We ought to get that zoning bylaw approved simply because we're doing good work. It frankly doesn't work that way, and I told this individual that. You have to generate goodwill on a regular, consistent basis, participate in the life of the community. Setting the tone. From my perspective, the president or CEO sets the tone of an organization, no matter its size or purpose. This is not something that can really be delegated, and supporters and donors want to see the president and CEO and determine her or his credibility, passion for the job, and vision for the organization. And while people on staff can echo those kinds of things, it's really important for the president and CEO to set those out carefully and, to the extent possible the time allows, really share with supporters and donors that vision and passion. And as I say, the tone setting cannot be delegated. It can be reflected by subordinates, but it really can't be delegated. I want to talk about revenue diversification. Depending upon one or a small number of revenue sources can be devastating. Even in the best of times, diverse streams of revenue should be pursued. Now, the dramatic example today throughout not only the research community, but any other communities that are dependent upon federal funding, the constraints from Washington, just put politics aside, the funding restraints are extremely significant. So people, for instance, in my world who have been dependent upon the National Institutes of Health for their funding are finding it much, much more difficult to get grants accepted or renewed. So the strategy really needs to be to look for alternate sources of revenue. In our case, the logical area would be the biotech or pharmaceutical industry. Mission focus. It's very hard, particularly in financially constrained times, not to think about opportunities that creep away, if you will, from your core mission contained in your mission statement. And I would argue that so-called mission creep should not occur without a very conscious decision-making process at the senior levels of the organization, including the Board of Trustees. So it's not that you can't broaden the mission when opportunity strikes, but it ought to be, again, a planned, conscious decision and decision-making process. And frequently these, if you will, mission creep decisions or opportunities entail a balancing act between diversifying revenue sources, which I've already said I really think is important, as well as being reasonably opportunistic. So you balance those against mission creep, which may take you away from what you're trying to do at the core values and core goals of your organization. So being opportunistic on this flip side of the coin, again, on the one hand, there is potentially concern about mission creep. On the other hand, if you can take advantage of interesting opportunities that are kind of collateral to the mission of your organization, then I would argue those are worth serious consideration. So I use just a couple of examples here. A hospital opening a rehabilitation clinic would often make sense, or a vocational school starting a job placement service. Again, might be quite worthwhile. Would it be worthwhile for, and this is an absurd example, but let me just give it anyway, a hospital opening a funeral home? That really wouldn't make a lot of sense in terms of core values and mission. Now, boards of trustees are really critical to the operation of not-for-profits. And selecting trustees purely on the basis of their giving capacity or stature in the community, in my view, can be counterproductive. You may end up with talkers rather than doers, people who want their name on the stationery but not necessarily are willing to put in the time and share their expertise and views. So I say it's a cautious process of evaluating a new member of your board of trustees. And really, a board of trustees is there to provide counsel in a variety of areas: real estate, legal, public relations, technology, commercialization, investing, donor acquisition, just a variety of things. I worked with an organization some years ago where virtually the entire board was made up of, it was a research organization, and virtually the entire board was made up of scientists and doctors. Well, of course, that's a component that should be reflected on the board, but where's the real estate expertise? Where's the legal expertise? Where's the public relations expertise and the investment expertise? These kinds of things are what boards really do and provide incredible value for essentially free. I think it's tremendously important to keep the board informed of pertinent issues. By and large, board members, trustees do not get compensated. In a few states, they're eligible for compensation. Most states, they're not. But whether they are or not, the fact is board members do not want to be blindsided or embarrassed. Often they're recruited to a board by a friend or a business colleague. They want to be sure that they're doing right by the organization and within the community. And they don't want to have bad news just sprung on them. So very, very important to keep trustees very much involved and up to date on issues, even if, and really especially if there's bad news involved. It is, I believe, important to try to strike a balance between board involvement and board management. Board should be involved in strategic thinking about issues. Again, let's just say it's a real estate issue or a public relations initiative or some kind of legal problem. So very, very helpful involvement of the board. On the other hand, if the board gets involved or the leadership of the board gets involved in day-to-day management of the organization, that's really generally counterproductive and should be avoided if at all possible. Again, the board's involved in a strategic perspective on hiring the CEO, and then providing specialized expertise in areas of their professional expertise. Now, I hope you all can see this particular slide that's coming up. There's one person who is happy in this slide, and everybody else is pretty grim. And that's this issue of what price genius or the high price of the destructive hero. If you have a marketing effort in your organization and the person is a supermarketer, or if he is the donor acquisition person, chief fundraiser, or if he's the chief scientist or chief of acquisitions in a museum, does his job extremely well, that's really not the issue. The issue is the collateral that goes with his or her performance. And if the individual kind of takes the oxygen out of a room when they come in, and is so mono-focused on their tasks and their responsibilities and is not part of a team, can have just a terrifically negative working environment that at the end of the day costs you more than getting rid of the person. So I think it's important to first try to manage the destructive hero, but if that doesn't work, I think working with the board of trustees, it's really important to move that person along, even if there's a financial penalty in doing so. Because, again, there is a delicate balance, it seems to me, as far as how a team is assembled and operates. And having one person who is messianic in character can really be destructive to the whole organization. And I'd be happy to talk more about that or any of these issues in the question and answer period. My final slide really is a mix of different thoughts on leadership, and then we can open it up to responding to questions. First of all, I want to say that listening is an art form. Listening is an art form. I'm sorry to hesitate there for a minute. It's not just hearing people, whether they're your subordinates, your equivalents in the organization, but it is truly listening to what they have to say, being engaged, often taking what somebody says and giving it, sharing with them what you think you heard, so that you really get the substance of their concern or their idea or their proposed initiative. It's really, really important that people feel as though they're being listened to. And I would argue also that loyalty runs both ways very often and not unreasonably. A senior manager is going to say he wants his people or her people to be loyal to them. Fair enough. On the other hand, subordinates need to feel as though the CEO or their superior is loyal to them. So it really does run both ways. And loyalty can be demonstrated in a variety of different ways, but the point here is it is not a one-way street. I feel tremendously strongly that all staff, no matter what their station in the organization, need to be treated with respect. That goes whether they're the custodian or whether they're the chief fundraiser or general counsel or what have you. People want to know that we respect them and the job they're doing. And let's face it, whatever job they're doing, if you're paying them to be around and do a particular job, then it's important to the mission of the organization. It takes people all rowing in the same direction. So treating folks with respect, I just think, is terribly important. Kind of on a similar track, credibility, whether people believe you, credibility is a really precious resource. It seems to me that too many people squander that resource by saying, oh, everything is rosy, or we're going to be fine as far as the budget is concerned, or this is a great idea that I'm pursuing. If people aren't with you, if they don't understand the facts, if they feel as though you're pulling the wool over your eyes, you're going to lose their trust. And once you lose it, it's virtually impossible to get back. It's also important, I think, to accept the inevitability of failure and utilizing it to improve performance. I'm sure you've all heard that sharing, trying things, and I'm sorry, let me step back here. Failure frequently is a better teacher than success. You learn what you did wrong, you learn what you can do better. Success sometimes covers up the fact that you haven't really batted 100%. So learn from the failures. Trust that people will learn from the failures. And it also seems to me that if you don't tolerate a certain level of failure, then you're not going to achieve the great successes that you can as an organization. I think it's very important to establish clear objectives and expectations of every employee that is reporting to you. And similarly, those employees ought to have their sense. There ought to be a two-way street on this one as well. There ought to be clear expectations of what they're expecting of you. Just really is tremendously important to be upfront with folks and explain very clearly what you expect of them and what kind of goals you hope that they can achieve. I think one of the most destructive aspects in any organization, for-profit, not-for-profit, what have you, is people accepting credit and not sharing credit when the success was a real team effort. And the flip side of that coin is accepting responsibility when something doesn't go right. It's amazing how many people don't do that who are in responsible positions. And it's just very, very important to acknowledge mistakes and to also acknowledge successes. And success rarely is a single person's attribute. So with that, I would be happy to respond to questions or comments from any of you. There's, of course, a whole lot of things I didn't cover in this presentation, but I wanted time for a give and take with the attendees, and look forward to that discussion.
Well, thank you, Ken. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think our listeners did as well. We have a few questions for you. I guess I'll just start at the beginning. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, so first question we have, how have you found some ways to make a more diverse board? I was interested in your experience with a scientific board that didn't seem to be very diverse.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're right next to an Air Force base and a jet went by. But how do you develop diversity in a board?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me try to respond to that question by sharing my actual experience in an organization where I was CEO. It's not my current organization. But when I arrived, and this happened to be the organization that the board was heavily dominated by MDs and PhDs. Mm-hmm. We didn't have the breadth of expertise or the breadth of people within the community to really help with fundraising and other kinds of goodwill-oriented activities. So the first thing I had to do was modify the bylaws of the organization, which I did very quickly in order to allow more individuals on the board. Now, some people who were sympathetic to what I was trying to do in terms of diversity said, well, you've got too big a board there. The problem, of course, is it's very hard to get people off boards once they're on who are, let's say, ex officio members of the board. So rather than try to fight that battle, what I did was just broaden the number of people and broaden the diversity of individuals. So we did get people who were respected in the community, who had networks that could help us with fundraising, who knew about legal matters, who had good government contacts, that kind of thing. So it's a process.
Absolutely. That's actually a really interesting segue into our next question, which is, how do you recommend determining the right, in quotations, size for your board for your organization? How many board members is too many?
Yeah, that is a great question, as was the first one. And I think people would argue, and I've served on boards as a volunteer as well as worked with boards as a paid manager of organizations. And if you can have about a 15 to 20 person board, depending upon the size of your organization, I think that's pretty good. It provides allows you to get the diversity that you need and the expertise that you need without being unwieldy. Now, because boards need to be serviced, people need to spend time. I said in an earlier slide that the CEO can't delegate the vision, the passion, the credibility. That's something he or she has to do themselves. And so regular board contact is terribly important, and if you've got a board of 30 or 35, that's just tougher to do. Tougher, just there's not enough time in the day. On the other hand, if you're faced with a situation as I was in this previous position where I felt as though diversifying the board was necessary, but I didn't want to try to fight a battle of getting rid of ex officio members, I felt as though the lesser of two evils was to have a bigger board.
Mm-hmm. And so just for my own curiosity, in that situation, did you still call full board meetings regularly? And if so, was that successful?
Yeah, we did. And of course, generally with a board that size, you'd also need an executive committee, and arguably you'd need an executive committee even with a board size of 15. But because sometimes you really have to operate on the turn of a dime, and so it's hard to get a full board together on an emergency basis. So quarterly board meetings, I think, are appropriate. with in-between meetings of the executive committee. Because preparation for a board meeting, whether it's a committee meeting or a full board meeting, is a significant task to do it right. You don't want to go into a board meeting or a board committee meeting underprepared or unprepared.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting stuff. Thank you. Let's move on to our next question, still talking about boards. It says, sounds like you've learned a lot about working with boards. Could you share anything about how you keep a board at bay so they are not over-interfering? We have that problem so much with our board.
Yeah, that really is hard and often involves a real frank conversation with board leadership to say, look, it's very hard for me to do my job and have the flexibility as CEO to do my job if I'm constantly being questioned by the chairman of the board or by members of the board. Those are hard conversations to have, obviously, and sometimes really the only way to resolve the situation is to say, I just can't operate in this kind of environment, this kind of micromanaging environment. Sometimes an alternative approach, if that doesn't work or you just don't feel it would work, is to work with other board members who are particularly sympathetic to the situation, who are concerned about micromanagement on the part of the board, and see if they would be willing to take up the cause with the board leadership. That can be also very delicate, of course.
Of course. That's a very interesting perspective, and thank you so much. I think we're going to move on. Oh, wait, we have one more board-related question. Have you found some great team-building exercises or ways to increase senior staff working better with boards and et cetera? We have tried a retreat. Have you tried anything else?
I think an occasional retreat is a good idea, and I think we use those to decent effect in my previous position. We haven't done that as much in my current position or when I served as president here at Texas BioMed. I'm not, and this will be controversial, but I'm not a big fan of an elaborate strategic planning process, kind of the traditional strategic planning with board members and senior management involved. I'm a believer in strategic thinking, but the strategy development process can be very, very burdensome. It can be expensive, it's time-consuming, and often results in a strategic plan that sits on a shelf. So I think retreats to do some team building and to kind of clarify visions or concerns on an occasional basis can be a helpful exercise. If there's an underlying dissatisfaction between the board and senior management, and I'm not sure that a retreat is really going to address that problem. And maybe, again, what you have to do is call a spade, and either a CEO move on, or if there's enough receptivity on the part of the chairman of the board, he or she might move on.
Well, that is a great segue, actually, into our next question, talking about Price Genius. It says, can you expand more on Price Genius and how an executive should go about filling that gap when someone needs to leave? Is it fair to look for the same attributes in one other candidate, or does it require a reshuffling of the existing staff?
Well, it's kind of hard to generalize on these circumstances, but there are probably not many organizations that do not have or have not had in their recent past somebody who was what we might call a destructive hero or the self-described genius. And these individuals, again, very, very difficult to deal with, very, very narcissistic, and that is destructive of teamwork and the kind of fragile trust, accepting credit, acknowledging credit, accepting responsibility kind of balance that should exist in a good organization. So my point here is that you've got somebody who, let's say, brings in a lot of grant money or brings in a lot of philanthropic dollars or gets a lot of attention in the news media. So they're good at their job. They may be great at their job. On the other hand, the cost of having them around because they're so destructive of the team values and the team culture, that I would argue is something that should not be tolerated unless you absolutely have to have that person.
Mm-hmm. That is very insightful. Thank you. Our next question is, what can you say about hiring the right people? It sounds like you have learned a lot. Any tips?
Yeah, I think hiring talent is one of the very, very difficult challenges that any CEO has. And I've made mistakes and I've had some successes, and anyone who has done it enough will be candid enough to admit that sometimes you just luck out and sometimes you have bad luck. Mm-hmm. Frequently people look good on paper, they even look good in their first interview or two, but then when they get on board they're somewhat different than, or radically different than what they pose. But I think in the interview process with you as the CEO, you really need to corner individuals about what their core values are. You need to ask their reference sources what their core values are, how they worked as part of a team, whether they've got intellectual integrity. Of course, you expect that they're going to be professionally up to snuff, but there are a whole lot of personal kind of core values that are really important as well. So it's not just the skill set, it's how people apply the skill set and how they interact with their colleagues that are important. And so that's a due diligence process with regard to talking to references. It's due diligence as far as really having a candid conversation or conversations with these individuals yourself. And then there are just going to be times when you don't make a good hiring decision. That happens.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like you definitely have brought a lot to the table in terms of your approach to hiring the right people and learning from mistakes. We have one last question for you, I believe. And it's a little bit more, we have two more questions. So second to last one is, I am intrigued to know a little more of your background. Can you share a little more of what got you into your career track and what you had to do to prepare yourself to be a CEO?
Yeah, that's interesting. Career counselors hate my response to this. I was, my first chosen field actually was government service and elected office, and that didn't work out, so I went back to law school. To go to law school, I attended an evening program in Boston, and then just as I was graduating, a job availability came up, and I was working with state government at the time. Was not sure exactly what I was going to do with my law degree, and a job became open as the first assistant dean for administration at the Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine, which was just opening at the time. It was pre-opening. It had been established by the board, but they were not going to be accepting students for 2 or 3 years. Um, and so I thought I wasn't a frustrated MD or a frustrated veterinarian to be, but I just thought that would be an interesting opportunity. And that's what, and I worked there for 3 years at Tufts. It was fascinating, extremely hard work, very challenging, but extremely exciting. And it's fun to go back there now and see how Tufts Veterinary School, it's now called the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University, has really come along. So it was my move into the kind of biomedical sciences and administration and legal affairs was by accident, literally. Responding to an ad in the newspaper about the Tufts Veterinary School position. And then I just, in subsequent jobs, after Tufts, I went up to the Jackson Laboratory in Bar Harbor, Maine, where I was assistant to the director and general counsel there, or house counsel. And I just kept adding to my portfolio in terms of experience, but stayed within, after Tufts, within this community of independent research institutes. Also became active in the national association called ARI, the Association of Independent Research Institutes. And so that helped me kind of network and gain a reputation. So as I started looking for other things, that really helped. I think the key message is no matter what the job is, as you're a younger person, you're unlikely to get the ideal job. And so you've got to just build your portfolio of expertise and skill set, and that takes time.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking from a younger person's perspective myself, it's really motivational to hear just how exciting your career has been and how it not necessarily has followed the quote-unquote expected course, but it still sounds like you're pretty pleased with how it turned out. So the final... sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say I feel fortunate to have had the career that I have, and I'm going to step back now for a few months and kind of re-energize and decide what I want to do for the rest of my professional career, but it has been very fulfilling, and I've seen some exciting things happen and participated in some exciting things. So,
absolutely. I'm sure there's been a lot of great work done. So for our final question, we were asked, well, there's a comment also. I like the leadership style you seem to have. Do you have any tips for staying calm? I feel like my board and staff are a serious handful to manage at times. What have you figured out about how to stay calm? Help.
Yeah, that's a great question, too. I used to be somewhat criticized for being an impatient person, and over time I have become more patient. And it really, I think, is a matter of stepping back from an immediate situation, not reacting to an immediate situation. Whether it's in person, whether it's on an email connection, whether it's on a telephone call. I recognize how difficult these management positions in not-for-profits can be. And it does take patience, but I think my best source of advice is to not react immediately when something is said that is pretty offensive or it undermines your particular prerogatives as a CEO. I think what you need to do is just, again, step back, provide just some time some cool down time, and also see if there is maybe some common ground you can reach with that board member.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is about all we have time for today, but I would like to thank you again, Kenneth, thank you so much for being a part of this series and for your wonderfully insightful presentation. For anyone listening who joined us late or would like to revisit any of the information from this presentation, we will have a recording of it on our website, brimhallassociates.com. But also, if you would like to find out more about Texas Biomedical Research Institute, you can go to www.txbiomed.org. All right, well, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Natalia.
Thanks.